The Life of St. Jerome by Father Largent, Chapter 8, Part 2. His Last Ordeals. Jerome's refuge did not escape from the incursion of the barbarians. Towards the year 411, the Saracens invaded and ravaged the frontiers of Egypt, Palestine, Phoenicia, and Syria. Fresh exiles, notably Paninius, his mother Albina, and his wife Melania, fleeing from the cruelties and extortions of the perfect Hercules, who had revolted against the emperor, came to the Holy Land from Africa. In the midst of endless trials, beset by duties and visits which scarcely left him any leisure, Jerome became more and more oppressed by the burden of his years. "In the hours of the night," wrote the indefatigable veteran, "hours which I earn, or rather snatch, and which towards winter begin to be somewhat longer, by the light of a small lamp, I endeavor to dictate these lucubrations, such as they are, and absorbed in my exegetical labors, gain some respite from the cares of a tormented soul. Besides the effort of dictating, I find another difficulty, for my eyes, like those of the saintly patriarch Isaac, have grown dim with age, and I cannot read by lamplight the Hebrew works which, on account of the exiguity of the characters, are almost unintelligible to me, even in the daytime. As to the Greek commentaries, I can only read them through the eyes of my brothers." In spite of this, Jerome persisted in his work, and was about to enter upon a supreme struggle. In the famous letter to Demetrius, which was a sort of treatise upon virginity, he warned this young patrician maid, who had sought refuge in Africa, against some errors, in which Tillemont professes to detect traces of Origenism. As of old, when with a resolute heart and a firm voice he had adhered to the teachings of the Pope Damasus, Jerome exhorted to Demetrius to remain faithfully united to the Holy See. Having reminded the youthful virgin of the blows which Pope Damasus dealt to heresy, he wrote, "It is my religious affection which prompts me to warn thee, keep the faith of Innocent, the son and successor of Anastasius upon the apostolic throne, and however wise and well-informed thou mayest think thyself, never embrace a strange doctrine." In 415, the Spaniard Paulus Arrhizius, a disciple of Augustine, arrived in Bethlehem, bearing letters in which the Bishop of Hippo propounded two questions to the aged doctor. He consulted him upon the meaning of St. James's text, "For whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all," and closed his letter with the following humble words: Should thy irritation find anything to censure, I implore thee the right to write and tell me of it, and do not fear to correct me. One would indeed be unfortunate could one not listen respectfully to a man who has worked so much and with so much edification, and could not one give thanks to the Lord our God, who made thee what thou art, for the success of thy work. If it is my duty to be more disposed to learn from whomsoever it may be, that which it is well for me to know, than to impart my knowledge to others, how much more natural it is that I should be ready to accept this service of charity from one whose erudition has, in the name and with the help of the Lord, advanced the study of the Scriptures to an extent hitherto unheard of." In another letter, the bishop questioned Jerome upon the origin of the soul. This was not the first time that question had been submitted to Jerome, for as early as 411, the governor of Africa and his wife Anastasia had laid it before him. The problem was whether the human soul was immediately created by God at the very instant when nature ordains it to be united to the body, or whether the theory of a spiritual generation causing one soul to proceed from another were admissible. Upon this point, Augustine had hesitated, and as Cardinal Norris says, the audacity of the Pelagian party in declaring original sin to be irreconcilable with the creationist doctrine inclined the Bishop of Hippo towards the contrary opinion. St. Augustine tells us that in his answer, Jerome pleaded his absence of leisure to solve the problem, and as a matter of fact he did not solve it. In any subsequent letter, Although vehemently disclaiming the originist error of the pre-existence of souls, he does not seem to have adopted any solution of this difficulty, either in his books against Rufinus or in his letters to Marcellinus. Jerome was not the only learned doctor with whom the question has remained undecided. In the 12th century, St. Anselm prayed upon his deathbed that God might grant him for a few days more of life, in which to elucidate it. Not that he was, as Charles de Remisier tells us, one of those great restless souls, who prefer love to possession, and upon the threshold of heaven sigh for the labor and the hope of their earthly existences. But because, as a religious thinker, he would have wished to bequeath to his brethren one truth the more. The slow and sure workings of Catholic theology under the direction and with the authority of the priesthood have definitely solved the problem which tormented Augustine and Anselm, and raised a primarily consented theory of the immediate creation of souls to the rank of other positive doctrines. Orosius wrote to Lamont, left to St. Augustine occupied in combating the Pelagians, he found St. Jerome engaged in the same war. It was in this war that Jerome expended all his remaining strength. The great Eastern heresies had touched upon the mysteries of the divine life, and had ended in offering their supporters a false explanation of them. Pelagius, an Irishman and a shrewd of daring spirits, fixed the general attention upon human nature and professed to elucidate the mystery of the relations existing between created liberty and the concurrence and grace of God. There were two terms, one of which Pelagius suppressed, only acknowledging that of free will. According to him, a man possessing the divine gift of liberty could perform every duty, even the most difficult, avoid of all sin, and become invulnerable to the impulses of passion. The innovator also rejected the dogma of original sin. Nature was good and sufficient unto itself. It needed no healing remedy, nor any assistance which would raise it to higher spheres. The idea of the redemption, that great remedy granted to a great distress, was dying out, and even prayer was arrested as a stifled upon human lips, from whence it nevertheless springs spontaneously. If the grace of God consists in that he has given us the use of our own will, read Jerome, drawing legitimate conclusions from the theories advanced by Pelagius, is satisfied with our liberty. If satisfied with our liberty, we consider that we had no longer need of his help. Fearing that this very dependence might destroy our freedom of will, we should no longer pray nor try in order daily to obtain a gift which once received remains forever in our power, to move the divine mercy by our supplications. Let us also abolish fasting in continuance. Why should I exert myself to obtain through labor that which already belongs to me? All the rationalism of future agrees. Ages was anticipated in this haughty system, which undervalued human weakness and rejected all divine assistance. One can already hear the arrogant sophism of Rosiccio. I converse with God. I bless him for his gifts, but I do not pray to him. What should I ask of him? Pelagius had in turn taken his false doctrine to Italy, Africa, and Palestine. In Rome, he had won the protection of Melania, the illustrious widow. During a brief space of time, the Bishop of Hippo had also yielded to his charm, and Jerome had sympathetically received the innovator who knew how to regulate his speech and his silences according to circumstances. There were two disciples who propagated the doctrines of Pelagius with indefatigable zeal. One Celestius, who was less prudent or more daring than his master, and Gelenius of Eclina, a former pupil of St. Augustine and a friend of St. Polonius of Nola, who sang his Epiphaneum in the most poetic language. Jerome soon discovered the true sense and import of the assertions of Pelagius, and urged thereto by the faithful who referred to the defender and tried interpreter of the true doctrine. He finally determined to write to Sisyphion his letter against the new heresy. Perhaps none of his books, said Amedee Theory, better reveals the marvelous acuteness of St. Jerome's mind. To pass judgment upon such a man as Polygerus, he has a vague data which he had been able to collect from public rumor, from the reports of a few friends, or from the agility calculated conversation of the monk himself. Of the audacious preachings of Celestius, or of the Polygean writings, which were beginning to spread over the East, Jerome knew practically nothing. A few of the Polygean propositions shrouded in circumlocution and mystery were sufficient to enable him to reconstruct the whole of Polygeanism, to point out its dangers, the faith, and to furnish weapons against its leader. The letter to St. Delician, from which we have lately made quotations, contains a testimony which without pride, but in tones of legitimate assurance, Jerome, the septuagenarian, rendered to the immaculate orthodoxy of his long life, exclusively spent in the quest of truth. From my youth, since when many years have elapsed, he said, until my present age, I have written many works. I have ever been solicitous to set not before my readers, but that which I have learned from public teachings of the Church, and to follow not the arguments of the philosophers, but the simplicity of the apostles. For I remember this verse, for it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. And again, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men, I defy my adversaries. Let them examine every book which I have written up till this moment, and if they find that I have made any mistakes from lack of competence, let them publicly denounce it. Or else let them correct those things which are right, and I will refute their calumnies. Or should there be any foundation for their criticism, I will acknowledge my error, for I would rather correct myself than persevere in erroneous ideas. Besides this letter to Delician, famous in the history of the Polygean controversy, Jerome wrote his 3 dialogues, in which he quoted the Pharisaical prayer of the heresiarch. Lord, thou knowest that my hands are clean of plunder, and my lips pure of lies. It is with these lips that I implore thy mercy. Words which may or may not be Polygerus' own, but in which breathe the whole Polygean spirit of pride. In opposition to this vainglorious formula, Jerome cited the humble petitions contained in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our trespasses. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. He invoked the testimony of the liturgy, which Bossuet surnamed the chief instrument of tradition. If you acknowledge but one baptism, the same for infants and adults, it is clear that infants receive it for the sins they have contracted in Adam. Jerome did not omit the testimony of the divines. After alleging that of Saint Cyprian, he confronted his contradictor with the authority, at that time so weighty, of the Bishop of Hippo. Since long ago, the Pontiff Augustine wrote against thy false doctrine concerning the baptism of infants, two books which he dedicated to the tribute Marcellinus, the innocent victim of the tyrant Heraclius, and of the heretics. He wrote a third denouncing those who say, as thou dost, that if men be willing, he may preserve himself from sin without the help of grace, and has lately written a fourth for Hilarion, refuting thy false system. It is said that he is writing other books especially directed against thee, but they have not reached me. Not wishing to be reminded of Horace's lines, do not carry timber to the forest, I am inclined to seize this work. I should but uselessly reiterate the same things, or if I wish to say new ones, the brilliant genius has already said them better than I. Jerome did not desert the battlefield. To escape from it, he would have been obliged to leave Palestine, which was then ringing with the Polygean controversy. The general disquiet, which was thus agitating the Church, no doubt decided Bishop John to open in July 415 the Conference of Jerusalem. which was entirely composed of priests, from among whom a few Europeans, Avidius, Vitalis, and Passerius, equally vested in Latin and in Greek, were to serve as interpreters. Dominius, an orthodox and wealthy layman, formerly the controller of the imperial leagues, Largent, and invested by the Emperor Arcadius with the title of vicar of the prefects, sat also in the assembly. In the absence of Jerome, who perhaps had not been bidden to the conference, Orosius attended in all the ardor of his youth and intrepid faith. He reported the commendation passed upon Celestius by the Council of Carthage, and was loud in his praise of Augustine's and Jerome's refutations of the new dogmas. Polygerus, when called upon to explain himself, did so in an ambiguous manner. The only daring which he evinced was in the contempt which, to the indignant stupefaction of the assemblage, he showed for the Bishop of Hippo. The arch-heretic knew himself to be protected by the benevolent attitude of John, whose misadventures in the originate matter had failed either to warn or to make him amend his ways. The conference dispersed after having decided that letters and deputies should be sent to Pope Innocent, and after having enjoined silence upon all. This silence, however, was broken by the Bishop of Jerusalem, who accused Orosius of having advanced a heresy diametrically opposed to that of Polygerus. Orosius wrote his apology, and the controversy was reopened. Moreover, two Gallic bishops, Hieros of Arles and Lazarus of Aix, driven from their province by political difficulties, and drawn to Palestine by their desire to make a pilgrimage, denounced at that very moment the heresies of Celestius and Polygerus theologies. In the metropolitan of Caesarea, a council was convened at Disopolis, the Greek name of the ancient city of Lydia, at which Hieros and Lazarus, one of whom was ill, did not appear. Orosius, probably prevented by secret intrigues from attending, was also absent. However, the memorandum upon which Hieros and Lazarus had recorded a certain number of Eurononce's propositions was read at the council, and Polygerus was called upon either to justify himself or to retract. With the aid of evasions, sophistical distinctions, or audacious denials, Polygerus succeeded in convincing of his innocence. The 14 bishops presided over by eulogies and assembled at Diospolis. He was absolved, but plagiarism was condemned, from whence the diverse opinions of the conference, whose verdict Pope Innocent would neither censure nor approve, have arisen. The Bishop of Hippo has laid the responsibility of this verdict upon Gelenius of Viclana. St. Jerome, on the contrary, has found no better epithet to describe the council of Diospolis than that of contemptible. Polygerus had disavowed his errors merely with his lips. In his heart, neither he nor any of his party had the slightest intention of laying down their arms. His heresy was gaining ground in Europe, and even in the East. In Asia, which until then had only been engrossed in metaphysical questions, Polygerism excited considerable sympathy. Theodorus, the bishop of Mopsukia in Cilicia, and the apostle of the heresy, which disowning Christ's one and divine personality, attributed a separate personality to our Lord's humanity, favored the false doctrines of Polygerus, and even wrote a book against Jerome, which he later had the courage to destroy. Can one wonder at this same infirmity which drew together the adversaries of grace and the future apostles of a heresy, which was to debase Jesus Christ to the rank of a human being? As I have already said elsewhere, if Christ not be God, grace, which is the fruit of his blood, and suffering must lose its inestimable dignity and its priceless worth. If that were the case, why consider grace to be the succor without which the human will, although capable through its own strength and acts morally good, can never accomplish deeds worthy of heaven. The practical naturalism of the Western heretics and the speculative rationalism of those of the East saw one another across a distance, which divided them, that they might embrace. The discussion of ideas and texts did not satisfy the bellicose ardor of the Pelagians. Even the calumnies directed against Jerome did not satiate their relentless animosity. The coarse and ignorant rabble, which too often forms the rearguard of factions, soon added material violence to these less tangible offenses. One night in the year 416, the covenant at Bethlehem was broken into, and St. Augustine tells us that a band of lost souls, who it is said served the perverse designs of Pelagius, gave themselves up to the most incredible outrages. The servitors of God, both male and female, who dwelt in this refuge under the guardianship of Jerome, were cruelly beaten. A deacon was killed. The buildings of the monastery were set on fire, and Jerome only escaped from this furious assault by taking refuge in a tower, the same tower which later afforded refuge to the monks against the Arab invasions, and wherein Eustochium and her niece Paula, fugitive and half-naked, but always interpreted, also succeeded in concealing themselves. The Bishop of Jerusalem had foreseen nothing and had arrested nothing. He took no steps toward restoring the ruins or towards consoling the victims. Vanity and obstinacy had rendered this venerable person, who at that time was completing his 30th year of episcopacy, a more or less conscientious accomplice of revolting deeds of violence. It was, of course, possible to ask the governor of Caesarea for material protection, but Jerome, Eustochium, and Paula, feeling the necessity of seeking a higher authority as well, addressed themselves to the Pope, St. Innocent. Aurelius, the Metropolitan of Carthage, transmitted their grievances to the pontiff, but the merciful discretion of the supplicants omitted the names of the guilty, and the Pope in his answer to Jerome was able to say, "Moved by the spectacle of such great misfortune, we are prepared to exert the authority of the apostolic see to punish the crime, but thy letter does not designate to us the criminal upon whom we are to visit our displeasure, and does not formulate any precise accusation." The Pope severely reprimanded the Bishop of Jerusalem. "What preventive measures didst thou take? And when the calamity took place, what consolation, what assistance didst thou proffer the victims, who say they fear still worse evils than those which they have already suffered?" John had died by the time Innocent's letter reached Jerusalem in 417, and under his successor, Jerome was able to breathe more freely, for although some of the Pelagians continued to live in Palestine, at least their leader had been banished from it. No, Jerome wrote to the Ecclesian priest, Reperius, in language which continually reminds us of Sallust. Catiline had been driven from Jerusalem and from the whole province, not by any human power, but by the command of Jesus Christ himself. But I grieve to say that many of his conspirators still remain with Lentulus at Joppa. In appraising another friend, Apranius, of the distress to which he had been reduced, and of the peace which he at last enjoyed, Jerome wrote, "Your best course would be to leave all and come to the east, especially the Holy Land, for here all is tranquil. Doubtless the hearts of the heretics are still filled with venom, but they dare not open their impious mouths and are like asps, who stop their ears so as to hear nothing. Our house, as far as temporal goods are concerned, has been shaken to its very foundation by the violence of the heretics, but thanks to Christ it abounds in spiritual blessings, and it is better to have naught but bread to eat than to lose one's faith." No mention has yet been made of Jerome's last scriptural work, his commentary upon Jeremiah, which was frequently interrupted by the Pelagian persecution, and of which he only finished 33 chapters. He was growing weak and fast, losing his hold upon life. He could scarcely speak, and was obliged to lift himself upon his wretched pallet by the aid of a rope, when he wished to give instructions to his monks. A supreme trial was reserved for the evening of Jerome's life. In the course of the year 418, Eustochium, at the age of 34 years, of which had been spent in the convent of Bethlehem, fell asleep in the Lord. As Jerome wrote to his friends in Africa, Alypius and Augustine, such a sorrow caused him to disdain the outrageous writings of Aeneas, the Pelagian. Providence, however, had not left him alone in his affliction, for the youthful Paula, whom he loved as if she had been his grandchild, was by his side. This, said Theory, was the third generation of woman, which the most illustrious of the great Roman houses had sent to the Dalmatian priest to be to him a guardian angel in the desert. This last was the angel who ministered to him upon his deathbed. A handful of people which the course of events had led from Rome to Hippo, and from Hippo to Palestine, namely, Pananius, his mother Albina, and his wife Melania, the heiress of a famous name, also surrounded the aged saint with pious care. Jerome passed away close to the cave of the Nativity on the 30th of September 420, leaving, we are told, the direction of his monastery to Eusebius of Cyrene, though bequeathing to the entire church immortal examples and immortal works. There is no saint who lends himself less easily to legend than does Jerome, for his whole life is known to us. His works and his letters enable us to follow him through most of it. Yet legend has fastened upon him. Should this cause astonishment or dissatisfaction? Legend was a homage which memory and popular imagination rendered to a man whose moral stature surpassed all ordinary proportions. Of the facts which legend had embroidered upon the austere woof of a simple and laborious existence, I will mention but one, the incident of the wounded lion whom Jerome healed, and who became the guardian of the monks of Bethlehem, and assisted them in their rustic labors. This lion, who must be closely related to the wolf, tamed by St. Francis of Assisi, has escorted, if I may so express it, the hermit throughout many centuries has served him as a symbol and appears stretched at the feet of the dying saint in Domenico's picture. But after all, like many other symbols, it has a foundation of truth. The generations of artists which have depicted the Bishop of Hippo clasping in his hand the heart which, when finally weaned from unworthy affections, steadfastly adored the truth, were as justified in doing as in giving Jerome the lion as symbol. None of the fathers of the church had better exemplified the characteristics of this noble animal, such as they are described to us in natural history, in fables, or in poetry. Jerome was intemperate and generous. He faced his adversaries without pausing to count their number or to measure their strength, and if at times a mighty roaring escaped him, it was the cry of a soul devoted to and desirous of truth alone, and if he were subject to violent outbreaks of wrath, his anger was often the anger of love. Thank you so much for joining me on this final part of the first book in this series of the life of St. Jerome. I hope all of you have a great day, great morning, great afternoon, great evening, whatever time of day it is for y'all. I hope all of you had a great time listening to this audiobook, and there's still one more part of this book left, so please don't go away. We still have a little more to go, and may God bless y'all.